welcome everyone to the Integrating Qualitative Methods in Evaluation webinar, a part of the Evaluation Capacity Building series. As you just heard, my name is Karen Gelb and I'm the Social Impact Coach at SVP. And I come to the role with a background in qualitative research in public health and well-being, as well as evaluation and impact measurement in consulting in the social purpose sector. So I'm really excited to be working with SVP, and I'm super excited to be talking to you today about integrating qualitative methods into evaluation. I think it's a really fun sphere. So I'm joining you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, which is also known as Vancouver, BC, which is where I spend my days. And I feel really privileged to live and work on these beautiful lands and help steward their care and preservation. And I think it's really important to ground ourselves a little and start our learning kind of where we are at and in a sense where we are in the world and where we are kind of in our day and in our time. So for those of you so inclined, I just invite you to share in the chat section a little bit about the lands or cultures that ground you. Whether that's where you are now or where you grew up or the identity that centers you. And for those of you who don't feel comfortable sharing, that's totally okay. I just invite you to take a minute to reflect on that. And since I'm one of those people who can't type and talk at the same time, I'll give us just a moment to do that. I see some people sharing in the chat. That's great. For me, the growing culture of land acknowledgements is just really an opening to reflect on equity and power and reconciliation as we move forward. And so I just invite all of us to hold space for that reflection on as we kind of move through our content today, but also following the session and as you're thinking about, well, so we're here to talk about integrating qualitative methods into evaluation. My goal today is to give you sort of like a flyover view here of qualitative methods, dropping down and giving you some anchor points to orient your thinking to your own work. But we're going to try and cover an overview of qualitative methods and kind of what they're all about, and then look at how we would integrate them into impact measurement. And then touch on some of the core elements of qualitative analysis, and then kind of zoom in on a few key elements for success. And if everybody's still feeling good and has the energy, I'm going to do just a tiny bit of myth busting around some of the common questions that come up. And then, as Helen said, we'll have time for questions and reflections and discussion at the end. I do want to reiterate, though, that if there's something that like just really isn't making sense to you or is unclear, feel free to chime in as we go. I'll try and pause as we go through each section so we can just make sure everybody's still on the same page. And it's a small enough group that we can try and accommodate and meet everybody's learning needs in that way. So don't be shy around that. So jumping right in, I just wanted to ground our conversation in the types of data. So broad strokes, data is generally categorized into quantitative and qualitative data. So these two big categories. So quantitative data will usually be numerics, numbers, and they're ideal for measurement and statistical analysis. They're really good for helping to demonstrate what is going on. Quantitative data, broadly speaking, is really well suited for like population level data. So big studies of our entire population, broad sample sets. And then at a smaller level, they're really good for describing numerically what you're seeing happening. Qualitative, on the other hand, is going to be mostly what I describe as these like unquantifiable things. So things like narratives, visuals, images, they're things, but they're not number things usually. Qualitative is ideal for exploring impact and meaning. We often talk about its value as being around understanding how and why something is happening. So some of those mechanisms of action, they're really, really well suited for situational data, smaller sample sizes, and for exploring experiential dimensions of what's going on. So that's kind of a big concept, but what do qualitative methods actually look like? So qualitative methods can take many, many forms. That's one of the things that I love so much about them. But some of the more common ones that you've probably heard about are things like interviews, focus groups, engagement sessions, maybe art projects or mapping type work, and even surveys. And I just need to draw attention to that because I know sometimes people kind of really get it in their head that surveys are only quantitative, and there is room for surveys to be both or to be qualitative. So that definitely is an option. So versions of these things that you guys may be used to seeing would be maybe something like a pulse check. If you ask your members a question of the week or a question every month, that's a version of an interview or check-in. Maybe you ask standard questions, open-ended questions at every client check-in or at, say, an intake or an exit. That can be qualitative data. A photo journal project or art submissions from participants, that's also a type of qualitative data. I know a lot of organizations tend to have these days like a journey map or a program map or a participant experience journey. That's also qualitative data. Or in-depth client stories. So zooming in on one story. All of those could be types of qualitative data that you might be used to seeing. So what does the data look like? So pretty much the data ends up looking like what you imagine you're going to gather from those activities. There's not a ton of mystery here. So if you're doing interviews or check-ins, you're likely to do that, to turn that into, or to get some sort of narrative, whether that's a transcript or listening to the recording again. If you're doing focus groups, then you're going to get a transcript of the group conversation usually. If you're doing engagement sessions, well, it might look like flip charts with feedback from everyone, or it could be posters that people develop together, or maybe had a graphic facilitator helping. That could also be what your data is going to look like. If you're looking at art data, this, like I said, it can be photos from a photo journal project, or paintings or drawings. And if you're using mapping tools for qualitative data collection, usually you're going to get some sort of visual representation of a journey, perhaps a participant journey or steps in a program or some sort of process map. So those are the tangible pieces that will be your data. That's what you would hold in your hand. And the column on the left there is the method that you're using to collect that data. So qualitative and quantitative approaches, I think, are really both wonderful. I just wanted to, before we get too far into qualitative, really just make sure that, I don't think there's one that's better or worse. You're going to hear me say this several times. I think goodness of fit is key. So understanding a little bit about the ways that they're similar and different can be really helpful for decision-making around what tool you want to use for your impact measurement. So some key similarities between qualitative and quantitative approaches are that they're both fabulous and have a use and a value. So there's not really a wrong choice here. They both offer you an amazing set of tools for gathering information. I think both are doable, and I think it's important to remember that. There's not one that is going to be easier or harder to access. They're just different. So again, it's going to be assessing goodness of fit. And both of them can bring more value when they're linked with existing research or evidence. And I won't go too much into that, but just to note that they are both the same in that way. You can add value to any type of work that you're doing if you're linking it into other available evidence. So one thing that I do want to flag here is that it's really, really important to remember for any quantitative work that you're going to do at an organizational level, barring a few exceptions, you will always, always, always be doing descriptive statistics. So that means that you're going to, like descriptive statistics let you count and measure and report on observable dimensions of what you're doing. So they let you describe what's happening numerically. This can be really useful. They're a great tool, but it isn't to be confused with inferential statistics. So that's the big word, the inaccessible word for when you're trying to reach conclusions that go beyond your immediate data. So inferential statistics is where you get into like sample size, your confidence interval, if it's statistically significant. All of that is relevant if you're trying to use your data set to make some generalizable finding. At an organizational level, you're going to be using statistics to describe what you're seeing. And so from that mindset, it's helpful to orient in that, because both quantitative and qualitative cases, you're going to be reporting on your world. One is reporting numerically on what's happening, and one is reporting non-numerically on what or how and why things are happening. So they're both quite similar in the way that organizations tend to use them for impact measurement. Key differences are many of the things that you have probably heard of already or would expect. The number of people you can engage in the work tends to be quite different. It tends to be a smaller amount of people for qualitative methods, whereas you can get a larger sample with something like surveys. The type of questions you can answer, for sure, that's going to be a little bit different. And then the methods that you'll use and the type of analysis you'll do. Okay, so now we're going to just dig into qualitative. So qualitative is just all about exploration. They're about going deep and not broad. So quantitative is often referred to as a tool for that broad understanding, that those like big surveys give you a sense of the landscape or kind of a really big view, whereas qualitative is known for taking you deep into the experience or situation or context. So qualitative lets you explore your impact and meaning to understand how and why something is happening, not just what something is happening, or not just what is happening. So interviews, mapping, art, all of these things, they can help you see what the landscape looks like. It can be for different people, or what each person from different vantage points can see, or maybe what's happening below the surface and how does that relate with what we see above the surface. So they're really known for getting at that depth of the experience and exploring mechanisms of change. So how is that useful for impact measurement? In a few different ways. It lets you hear impacts and explore them from different perspectives. It lets you invite member and participant voices, so you can get a lot of different perspectives in your impact measurement, which can be really, really valuable for program assessing your programming and goodness of fit. You can understand your situation and your story really well, and you can understand how and why your program contributed to identified outcomes. And one of my favorite things about them is that you can start small and build over time. I get really excited about that. That lets you start where you're at and explore what you want to explore. And I think that's a really big sort of value add for a tool when you're integrating it into an existing context. It's agile in that way. So this is all very conceptual and abstract. So, how is it useful for your impact measurement? Well, qualitative approaches are really useful for getting to know and reporting on your specific context. So they're going to let you know your own organizational or community story, all of its strengths, its nuances, or its context elements. And in turn, that lets you communicate your impact in a really nuanced and personalized way. This can be really beneficial. I think one of the biggest things to remember is that you can lean on evidence from other studies. You can, pull numbers to make an argument for impact for your type of programming from the existing evidence. And in most cases, right, that's going to make your case stronger. But you can't borrow direct impact information. So often it can be a matter of asking yourself, with your limited resources, what could you get from elsewhere to show your impact or value, and what's best coming from within? And I think that's one of those places where qualitative can add a lot of value. You can shine a light on your specific strengths and values and link them into the existing data set to make a really strong case for value. Another reason it's really, really useful is that, I find most organizations are already doing some sort of qualitative data collection in some way, even if they don't know it. So whether it's something like the check-ins or feedback forms or, a group conversation, you guys as organizations are really set up to respond to your community and to meet a specific need. And so generally, in one way or another, people are already trying to get a sense of, how are we doing this? Are we on point? How can we meet these needs and hear what is working and what isn't? So for a lot of organizations, I find that this is just a set of tools that lets you do what you're doing in a more framed way, so that you can learn from that data collection and then understand and communicate your impact. And the other thing that I want to add is it's just, I guess, beyond the impact measurement, it can be useful for organizations because it can actually serve multiple purposes. So if you get community or alumni or other stakeholders involved in data collection or sense making, so if you're using some participatory methods there, for sure that can help make your data better and your analysis stronger, but it can also help build community or expand your networks through the process of doing that. And you may find that you learn about new opportunities or new partnerships from an engaged process like that, beyond just what you learn from the data collected. That's a little bit, I find, of a value add beyond the scope of what it may bring to an impact measurement. So I want to pause there. We're going to shift to how we integrate it into your impact measurement, but I just want to check in and see if everybody's feeling like they're with me. They've got those core contexts. Any burning questions anybody wants to check in on before we keep moving ahead? Okay, cool. So I know you're all super intrigued and you're really jazzed and you're thinking, great, I want to integrate it into my impact measurement. And one of the first questions that I often get is, which method is best? Like, which is the real one? Which is the strongest one? What should I use? And you'll hear me say this over and over, and I'm sure some of you have already heard me say it, but they're all valid. When done well, they are all valid. And the most important thing that you can do is pick the one that is best suited to your context. Pick the methods and the tools that will answer your questions and fit your capacity and really be able to be used by your organization. I cannot stress that enough. So how do you go about integrating it into your work? Where do you start? Well, no surprise, I'm going to encourage you to let feasibility and fit be your guide on that. So start by asking yourself some reflexive questions. Why do I want to use it? Will it be most useful for the questions I have? Which methods might be most useful to get the type of data or the type of content I want to use? Does it complement the message that I'm trying to share, or does it bring up conflicting issues around that? Does it fit with work we're already doing? And does it fit with your capacity and workflow? And just like really, I can't stress it enough, set yourself up for success by making a feasible plan. There is so much latitude in your methods to set this up small and build it over time. And that time horizon can be over years. You can start with 3 questions and add a question the next year and another one the year after. So starting with a feasible plan with a good data collection approach and guiding questions is just, it's worth it. It's so worth it. So one of the biggest things that organizations tend to do is weave it into their existing strategies. And like I said, people do this because it turns out they are already doing some sort of qualitative approach that can be worked with. So you can look for those opportunities to streamline and interweave your data collection into those processes. Another thing you can do is look to do like a parallel or subsequent qualitative arm. So if you have a lot of quantitative data, you can see what interesting things it tells you and then design a qualitative piece to dig a little bit deeper and maybe do some follow-up questions into a few key areas that you want to know more about. Or you could do them in parallel. And the other thing that I want to encourage is for people to look for like windows of opportunity or the strategic opportunities to do different elements of work. And I think, a lot of people, when they think of methods and they're thinking of research methods, get a little bit tangled up in feeling like for research to be good or for these methods to be good, we can't be opportunistic in some elements of it. And I don't think that's the case. I think for the work to be done well, you need good questions. You can't have leading questions, and you need good methods and analysis. But I think you can do so much more if you're strategic and opportunistic about the opportunities for maximizing your capacity. So you can ask yourself things like, what are these existing opportunities? If we're doing a check-in and we already do a check-in with our clients every time we see them, could we build in, 1 or 2 standard questions that we start to ask across the organization to start collecting our data that we'll analyze down the road? Or, what are the points where you can burst data collection or analysis? So often that might be at the end of an event, or a lot of organizations get a student helping them over the summer or throughout the year, or maybe someone from an employment program. Those are great opportunities to just do a sort of deep dive, whether that's on the analysis or the data collection or any part of it. And so I encourage people to take advantage of that. Don't shy away from those opportunities. So not everybody uses logic models or is familiar with them, and that's totally okay. But for those of you who do work with them or know about them, this can just be another way that people anchor methods to their measurement. So key terms here are inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So inputs are the things you put into your organization or program to make things happen. So stuff like time, staff, resources, those sorts of things. Outputs are the things that you produce, and they're measurable numerically. They're things like number of participants, hours of programming, or percent satisfaction, that sort of thing. Program monitoring and reporting usually falls into that sphere of output measurement because they're the measurable things. It's the natural fit. This is rarely, no surprise, where you're going to get the most bang for your buck with qualitative. Outcomes, on the other hand, are generally the changes that you're hoping to see as a result of your work. They're often, not always, but they're often about relationships, experiences. It could be skill development or systems change and your contribution to those changes. So this is a really good sphere to look at for qualitative because it lets you explore exactly that, seeing the how and the why things are happening, or getting the diverse experiences, or exploring some of those like ripples or unanticipated impacts that roll out. So for those of you who do use logic models, have a gander at your outcomes, and that can help guide where you might want to work this in. So I want to stress that qualitative methods are accessible. That's one of the things that I love about them, but they still take care and attention to do well. And just because anyone can ask someone else questions, that doesn't mean that's analyzed data. So you still want to take the time to set your work up well and really take care to attend to your methods. It's still a really important step. So I realized I didn't pause there. I was going to dive right into qualitative analysis, but I will pause for a second. How's everybody feeling? And does anybody have any questions about some of what we covered for how we can integrate these methods into our impact measurement? Excellent.
No questions yet, but would love as many concrete examples as you can give as you step through these things. I think that'll make it real for me.
Yeah, that's fantastic feedback. I love it. Okay. So we're going to, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the analysis, and we'll try and anchor it down in some concrete examples. And we'll also loop back to that in some of our discussion. Thank you. Okay, so big concepts in the analysis. Basically, there's a variety of different types of analysis. But generally speaking, the common element is that you're going to look to see what the data says across your participants. So you're going to be looking for commonalities or discrepancies or emerging themes or patterns. So when you do that, that method is called thematic analysis, and it's useful across many different qualitative data collection methods. So whether you're doing interviews or dialogue sessions or even open fields sections in a survey, you would likely bring this method. So I just wanted to touch on what that looks like or what one might expect in that. So like I said, generally speaking, it's when you're reviewing your data for these emerging themes or topics or like big ideas that show up. So that could be something like maybe some people talk about the most meaningful impact of a program was actually being seen or heard by someone. So that's really common in housing programs. When people are asked about what the most meaningful impact of the service is, oftentimes the expected answer is going to be shelter or housing. But one of the things that's really does tend to come up a lot in the housing and shelter sector is about being seen and being treated with respect and dignity. And also things like maybe having a sense of hope or possibility. So when we're doing a thematic analysis, we're in one way or another looking for the types of themes that are going to come out of the data we've collected. We tend to conceptualize doing this either as a top-down or a bottom-up approach, or kind of a bit of both. So a top-down approach would mean that you're intentionally looking at your data for key themes or topics that you want to know about. So you might have set out with questions like, asking about how you're meeting participants' needs, satisfaction with services, or how skills have developed from your programming. You could ask some open-ended questions about that. And then you'd look over those transcripts looking for information on, you know, somebody shared that they learned how to cook with a new type of fresh produce, or somebody has learned how to fill out their disability forms online. So you would be looking for specific examples of what you were asking them about. Whereas in bottom-up type thematic analysis, it means you tend to be asking these like really broad exploratory questions, and you want to remain open to seeing what sort of pops up from the data. So an example of this could be asking people to share about their most significant experience in a program. So it's a pretty open question. And you know that you're going to hear something that people found valuable, but you're really open to what that might look like. So then you're going to review your data, and you'd be looking for any clues around that, whether it's somebody saying that the programming itself was valuable, or it meant so much to have relational connection with a consistent group. You would start to highlight those elements in your thematic analysis. And then, like I said, you can actually mix those approaches. And this is what I find is really helpful for a lot of organizations, because it lets you be a little bit more opportunistic. So you can get answers to the questions you need information on, that you're clear you need information on, whereas other questions could be more exploratory. And in this sense, you could interweave your data collection. So the big thing to know about this is that whatever method you're going to choose there for your analysis, you really just want to make sure that it connects with your evaluation questions. And you want to determine all of this stuff up front in the planning stage. So thematic analysis is so fun. You might just want to have a party. One of the value adds for me about qualitative is that there's lots of room for engagement. And this is so valuable for ensuring the validity of your analysis and checking that it's on track and makes sense, but also making sure that it's, it can have those other purposes as well. So for participatory approaches, you can have a data party. That's a thing. So you can invite your contributors, or it could be staff, or it could be members of the community that you're trying to get perspective on, to come and help with the sense making. And so that can look like, a 2-hour session where folks come together and are looking at some of the results from some qualitative questions or some emerging themes, and try and figure out how they fit together to make sense. And there's lots of different tools and ways you can do it, but the net result is that you have a group of people bringing perspective to how you make sense of the data, not just a group of people providing data. And as I've said already, just that process can build a strong sense of team or community, and it can really help build a sense of shared goals. So it's a fun dual purpose element to qualitative analysis. Or not. Not everybody wants a data party, and that's okay. And I just feel like I need to stress this as well. One barrier, I think, for folks to take up qualitative work is that they often get a little bit bogged down, feeling like they're going to have to do all of that analysis and make sense of what they're chatting about. Matt, I see your hand up. I'm going to finish this slide and then come back to the question. Awesome. So I always like to make it clear to folks that you can do something participatory engaged, but you really don't have to. You can do all of your own data collection and then hand that analysis over to someone. And that can be a staff member in a set amount of time. You can put boundaries around that so it doesn't just become a never-ending project. It can be, like I said, a student coming in to support this. And there's a couple of evaluation programs in town. They're often looking to partner with organizations. So this can be one of those partnerships. And there's also consultants who help with this. And for people who do qualitative work, you for sure can hand it over to someone to do the analysis in that way. Matt, what can you share with us?
I have never heard of doing a data party before. That sounds fabulous.
Yes.
I'm all done with Tupperware parties.
Right?
But data parties, surely, I mean, what more 21st century thing could there be than a data party?
Yeah, I love it.
How would you do that? Are there guidelines for this? Are there party invites for this? Is there a data collection model for this?
Love it.
I'm eager to know more.
Yeah, such great questions. So like my answer to everything else, there is a ton of versatility. So data party has kind of become the term that sort of encompasses participatory approaches. There's one or two great guidelines that you can download and use. And I'll try and just make a note to share those in the follow-up material. But really, it's a really open process. So it's a little bit different, obviously, now that we're in the Zoom world, as opposed to being in a room. Often when you're in a room, one of the really fun things you can do is take some of your first round analysis. So you might have your key emerging themes, and you can like dump them all on the table and everybody's going to help sort them. And you get really kind of interactive. So kind of exactly as the picture shows, often you can have flip charts in different sections of the room, or help people collaboratively come up with the larger themes, categories that they would use to describe the sub-themes or codes. And yes, like 100%, some people, I have been to data parties where we have like party hats and we do party invites and we have party snacks, and like, yeah, it just is a super fun thing. And then of course, it's all about making folks, people doing what works for them. So there's been some great ones, in fact, within the SVP family. I know some folks who have done wonderful mealtime ones. So like a family community dinner tied to the data and sense making. And then in the Zoom world, there's a lot more just using some of the interactive tools that we have to help people contribute and sort through the information. And I'm happy to chat more about data parties.
Great.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to breeze us right into just some of the key components to think about for being successful with qualitative methods. And then we can keep going from there. So the key elements that I think are keys to success are starting with a plan and a goal. I'm going to dig into some of these a little bit more, but the overview is start with a plan and a goal. Ask useful questions. Do work systematically and analyze with integrity. And then don't generalize. And, I can talk a lot more about that, but the important thing to remember is to stick to your data scope. When you are doing any data collection and analysis, you need to stick to your scope. So you can use other evidence to make a bigger case if you need. And this applies whether you're talking about descriptive statistics or whether you're talking about qualitative data. Don't make inferences. Don't try and suggest that your data is going to show more than what is happening in your sphere. We can do a whole other session on that. So start with a plan. I've said it a lot already. I'm going to keep saying it. Goodness of fit is so imperative for success. So asking evaluation questions that are best answered with qualitative data is important, and ensuring that your context is going to enable this type of work and that the work will be of value once you are done. These are some of the most important questions that I encourage people to start with, because there's tons of different qualitative tools we can use, but don't start with picking a method that sounds nifty. Start with what you want to know. What is the information that you need? And what can your organization manage and cope with? What's going to be a value add instead of drawing unlimited resources? And it's knowing your end goal that enables us to do this assessment. So Your plan is really your best tool to be successful here. And you want to take the time to work backwards in a plan, detailing what you're trying to accomplish, for who, by when, and all those elements, so that you can then start to move forward through that process. Asking useful questions. Take some time here. Just take the time. You want to make sure that they connect with evaluation questions that you've set out. And you want to ensure they're going to give you data on the indicators you want to assess. And to do this, like, test them out. That's the best thing that we always encourage people to do. If you're, trying to do an interview, you're going to inevitably come up with your interview questions, and maybe you think you're totally on point, and then, even seasoned qualitative interviewers, right, think they've generated something great, and you do one test run with someone and you realize they interpret those questions so differently that you get answers to things that it's not at all what you wanted. So just taking the time to test them out is a really important step. And I think it's also just important to remember when we're often feeling really rushed and trying to just get through the process. For all of these things, this taking time up front, just remind yourself that you can come back to a good data set in 6 months or in a year or in 18 months and do something cool with it. The quality of the data won't degrade, but you cannot fix a cruddy data set. So if you don't take the time at the beginning to really think through what questions you need information with, then you end up in that kind of pickle where you put a lot of work and time and energy into getting data, and it's like, worst case scenario, you can't do anything with it, or you're trying to retrofit it to your needs, and it just gets murky and not pleasant really quickly. Doing work systematically is essentially, it's what takes you from anecdotes to data for analysis. And that's really important. The key to this is making sure that you have a repeatable method or an approach. So a repeatable method would be something like, say you're asking those client questions at every client interface, and you're going to have 1 to 3 questions that you're going to ask them. So your method that would be repeatable would be that all frontline staff are trained in this. Everybody is asking the same 1 to 3 questions in addition to the basic questions that they may ask, and that you're going to document it in the same place and in the same way. The nuance around this is that you're allowed to be human. And this is another point where I find a lot of people get tangled up or deterred from qualitative. And you're allowed to let the words change a little bit in the way that they would conversationally. You're allowed to change them. If you're finding you're asking these questions of clients, you're getting totally the wrong answer, you can reconvene and change the wording a little bit. That's okay. That's still allowed. That's still part of a repeatable method. That's part of good methods. But what you don't want to do is jump around from asking 1 question to 3 questions. Some frontline staff asking it, others not. Some people documenting it in a shared place. Some people doing it on paper. That's where you start to get really chaotic with the quality of data that you're collecting. And analyze with integrity. So hold yourself accountable. Have a team to check your work. So that can be a data party. That can be your staff colleagues. That can be a working group or a community of practice. That can be checking in with me or someone like me that you have in your network. The more experienced people are with qualitative work, the more comfortable I would be saying they can do an independent analysis. But again, even the most seasoned qualitative researchers or folks doing qualitative analysis are going to check in on the integrity of their analysis and the biases that they're bringing to their work with the team that they are working with and for. Decide ahead of time how you're going to analyze your data. We've touched on that, but it is really important. You don't decide that once you're looking at the data. That's not okay. That's going to skew how you're making sense of it. You decide ahead of time what you're going to try and do so that you're bringing that consistency to the method. And then check your biases. And you really need to be doing this from the outset. This isn't just something you do at the analysis stage, but it can be really important at the analysis stage to make sure that that team you have working with you is going to feel comfortable calling you out if they think that you are projecting something that isn't there, especially when we're looking at data on our own programs or services that we might feel really positive and really passionate about. So we might overly project strengths onto them and be less inclined to see nuanced problematic feedback. So being intentional about that is one of the ways that we can just be prepared to see that emerge in our content. And there's the always remembers as part of operating with integrity is power, privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity. And these are just so important to remember. So power, you have it and your participants may not. Any type of data collector or service provider will hold power over the people they serve. And especially if you offer a service that people need, like a basic service. So if you're providing shelter, food, and meeting basic needs. So you really have to account for that in how you're asking questions and how you let your participants know the safety of responding. And I'm happy to unpick this further in the question time or in subsequent conversations. But privacy, dimensions of privacy will affect your answers. So think about where you're asking people for information. Things like, is it a private space? Is it a group setting? Are there safety or trigger risks for folks to feel comfortable sharing? Think about who's asking the questions. So, is it somebody, the same person who runs the programming or decides if somebody will get the service? Because, there can be conflicts there that would deter people from answering honestly. Confidentiality and anonymity, just a quick note to reiterate what a lot of people know around this, just they aren't the same thing for starters, and just never, ever, ever promise something that you can't uphold in this domain. So anonymity is when we don't know who the data is from. Oftentimes people think that's kind of the gold standard. I would just say that there's no, just like everything else, there's not a better or worse, they're just different. They all types of data, whether it's identified or de-identified or confidential or anonymous, is going to have strengths and limitations. So identified stories, so if you have a participant who is sharing a profound impact and they'll put their name or their face to it, that can be really, really powerful for communicating impact in a story, in a final report. And so it can be really valuable. Whereas confidentiality can help people feel open to share and you might get a little bit more information. And anonymous data is a really good option if you're trying to get positive and negative feedback. If you want people to feel really comfortable sharing things that didn't work. But again, just attend to whether you can actually ensure those things. And if you can't, don't offer them. And so I've got my eye on time and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to suggest that we breeze right to the conversation and see where people are at with that. How does that resonate for you, Helen, and everybody else in the room, quietly listening?
Yeah, Karen, I think that would be great to allow conversation, and then if we have time, we can maybe go back to the next lecture.
Totally.
Or we can also share that in the follow-up material.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love for people to have a chance. I have a bunch of questions. I'm sure others do as well. I'd love an opportunity for us to get into that